Hi, Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia here. Leica makes two different versions of the 21mm lens. So in this video, I'll just describe the differences between them and I'll show you a few photographs that I've taken over the years. 21mm is now getting seriously wide. We've spoken in the past about 28mm and 35mm and 50mm lenses. Anything wider than 35 is considered wide angle, and now we're way past 28 down to 21. I believe the first 21mm lens came out in the mid-50s, 1955, I think, and it became a classic because I believe it was one of the widest angle lenses that money could buy at the time, and it became very, very useful for documentary photography. And I would draw your attention to the work of my good friend Tim Page, who worked with the 21mm Leica lens in Vietnam. And he has a collection of images, 21 pictures taken with the 21mm lens, which we featured at the Leica galleries in Australia a few years back. And you can see a video on our YouTube channel about him talking through using that lens and why it worked for him, which was quite instructive for me, certainly, very interesting. From my own point of view, the 21mm sits in a place in my camera range or my lens range that is now genuinely wide angle with the perspective that goes along with that. And what I mean by that is we're now talking about exaggerated perspective, particularly to do with parallel lines. And also it includes a much more wide range of subjects in the frame. So you have to be really careful about your composition. I have used the 18mm Super Elmar extensively. In fact, it was the first lens I ever bought in the M range. They no longer make the 18, which is a bit of a shame, but the 21 is not that dissimilar. So everything I say about the 18 and the 21 are pretty much interchangeable. So with that wide angle of lens, you're now starting to see the distant objects getting pushed right into the distance and being diminished. But closer objects are being exaggerated. So that perspective difference between size of foreground and background objects is now significantly exaggerated. Some people don't like that effect. Some people find it's very powerful graphically. If you want to go for an understated, neutral type look, then you're going to be thinking about using 35 or 50mm lenses, and that's fine. But if you want to go for a more high graphic style look, then 21 18mm might actually be your cup of tea. But be aware that just because they are wide angle and they do exaggerate perspective, depending on what you're photographing, that perspective may actually be hidden and you may not know that the shot was taken with such a wide angle lenses. I've got a couple of examples coming up which I'm going to show you. So let me just show you some of the pictures that I've been shooting over the years. This first one is the Taj Mahal in India, and this is a shot that just simply wouldn't work with a lesser lens. When I say lesser, I mean lesser angle of view lens. You simply couldn't fit this in to the angle of view of a 35 or a 28mm lens. And also it makes the point very strongly about how what are actually parallel lines receding into the distance converge very sharply, and you get this very graphic triangle, if you like, at the bottom of the frame, which takes you straight through to the Taj Mahal. And with it being obscured by the mist, it kind of looms out of the mist once your eyes are drawn towards it. You might not notice at first. And the angle of view has also allowed me to include the arch which I'm looking out of. So an impossible shot with anything other than a 28 or an 18mm lens. Here again, this is a sort of image that you can't shoot with anything other than a super wide lens. This is something that I call puddlography, and I was introducing this concept to a group of Academy guests in Cuba a few years ago. And I was making the point that if you hold the camera very low down, just above the surface of the water, you don't actually need much of a puddle to get a nice mirror effect. This puddle that you're looking at there is probably only about this wide and maybe a couple of feet long, but it doesn't really matter because of the geometry of these lenses. Just as I was making the point about this type of photography, a cyclist came through and I just grabbed the picture just by instinct. So the fact that I've nailed the wheel and the tower in the distance precisely, I have to be honest and say is good fortune. I won't use the word luck, but just good fortune. And the diagonal lines on the right take your eye straight to the subject. So it's very powerful geometry going on in this picture. And again, you really couldn't do that without a super wide angle lens. Now we're starting to look at some portraits here, and I've got a couple more coming up. This is shot on the 21, and it simply doesn't look super wide. It doesn't look super exaggerated. It just actually happened to be the lens I had on the camera at the time, and an opportunity arose to take this photograph of this gentleman in his car, and I took the photograph. If I'd been more time rich at the time, I might have changed to a 50mm lens and did more of a portrait of him. But by shooting on the 21, it allows me to include a lot more of the car and therefore include some context. So anything like environmental portraiture, the 21mm or the 18mm is going to give you that ability to include surroundings as well as your subject. You can get nice and close in, and as long as you don't put the subject too near the corners of the frame, in which case you will get a slight amount of stretching going on, then you wouldn't know. And most people I show this picture to say this was shot on a 28 or a 35mm lens. There's no cues really that it was shot on a 21. Same with this one. In fact, very few people even believe me when I tell them that it was shot on such a wide angle lens. Very close quarters. This is in Ethiopia, Lalibela. Very close quarters. No way to stand back. I'm in a corridor. There's a doorway to my left, which is where the light is shining through, so camera left. And simply by squaring up the subject, and the wall behind is very close, there is nothing to exaggerate the perspective of. So it just looks like a simple shot on whatever lens. It doesn't really have, there's no cues in this image to tell you what lens it might have been shot on. So just because you've got a 21mm lens on doesn't mean that you have to go looking for those strong diagonals. You can still use it as a general purpose lens, a lot more than you might imagine. Interiors, obviously this is where super wides come into play. This is Coleman's Kop in Namibia, and it's very hard to shoot these interiors without a significantly wide angle lens. It really works well when you can include multiple doorways and multiple sources of light. So this is the sort of thing where a wide angle lens is an absolute must. Probably could have done this on a 28 or 24, but the 21 was absolutely the tool of choice for this subject. Now, I've included this picture not because it's a particularly special picture, but because I had limited opportunities to shoot with the 21mm Summilux, which is f1.4, as opposed to the 21mm Elmar, which is f3.4. So big difference in light gathering ability. It's almost, what's that, 3 and a bit stops, isn't it? But the thing with the 21mm Summilux is that it allows you to use limited depth of field on a super wide angle lens. So these wine barrels are quite close to the camera and the workshop's quite a long way away. But it's very, very hard to tell from this picture what lens it was shot on, because you're getting mixed messages here. You've got the depth of field of a 50mm 1.4 or a 35mm 1.4, something like that. But you've also got a lot included in the frame, so it's clearly a wider angle lens than that. So this is a unique look that you simply cannot get with any other lens. If I'd shot it with the 21mm Elmar, I would have had a sharper background, which would be a lot weaker. It would look just not that appealing, but because the background is less important than the foreground, and you can still see hints of those barrels in the workshop, shooting this at 1.4 made it a much, much stronger image. And like I say, you simply could not shoot this on any other lens. One thing that 21mm lenses are really good at is that big, powerful sky effect. This is the coast of Queensland, not far from where I live, going for a walk in the evening, epic sky boiling over the horizon, bit of sun just bursting through at the last minute, and a single figure paddling in the water there. 21mm lens gives you that. You're looking up at probably 60 degrees above the horizontal, so it makes that sky look really looming over your head and includes a lot more of the great light that was going on. If I'd got a bit tighter with this shot, it would be, well, obviously a completely different image, but I love this sense of powerful sky just looming over the subject. And again, 21mm is ideal for that. This last picture here was taken in Myanmar a few years ago, and this was me holding the camera over the side of our boat, very, very close to the water, because I wanted to get a reflection of his orange jacket and trousers in the water. And if you If you remember what I said about my puddlography picture in Cuba, then the closer you get to the water and the wider the angle lens you use, the more that reflection shows up. It's also pushed the distant hills into the background, and with that last burst of evening light shining onto him, he's really stood out against that background of darker clouds. So again, very, very easy picture to take with a super wide angle lens, not so easy to take with a longer focal length lens. So you can probably tell from my enthusiasm in this video about how much I enjoy shooting with super wides. Some of my best photographs have been shot on super wides, probably on the 18, because that was the first lens I bought, and I've used that for well over 20,000 photographs in the last few years. I have less experience with the 21mm lenses because I don't own one. I have an 18mm lens, but in any case, the principle remains the same. I love that geometry and that you can get with a wide angle lens. And I also enjoy the fact that you can work in really tight quarters without necessarily giving away the fact that you're shooting with a super wide angle lens. If I had the choice, I would go with the 21mm Summilux lens. There's a look to it which you simply cannot get with any other lens. It's obviously quite big and heavy, and it's certainly not an inexpensive lens, whereas the 21mm Elmar is very reasonable and it's a lot smaller. In terms of quality, at the same f-stop, identical. No problem about, no question about it. Put them both on f4 and you'll have shatteringly sharp images from corner to corner. Obviously the Summilux opens a lot wider than that, but at f1.4 it's still tack sharp. So very, very different lenses. They're really almost at the opposite end of a spectrum here. But you take your choice, you pays your money, as they say. You pays your money, you takes your choice, I should say. Highly recommended. Anybody who's getting significantly into more possibly advanced photography should really consider getting a super wide. They're a little daunting at first because when you first look at the viewfinder, you go, oh my goodness, there's so much in that frame. But once you get used to it, you'll find that it's a very, very powerful lens and one that you should have in your armory of lenses at all times. My 18mm lens goes everywhere with me, and if I didn't have the 18, I would probably have the Elmar here, which would go everywhere with me. So there's the 21mm lenses. They are beautiful and highly recommended. My name is Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia. Hope you enjoyed this little look at a particularly effective lens in the range, and I will no doubt talk to you all again in the near future.